Good morning, and welcome to the 2021 Annual Report on Market Issues and Performance presentation. I see we still have participants joining the call, so I will hold off for another minute while people join. Thank you very much for your attention today. Okay. Welcome again to the presentation, the Department of Market Monitoring presentation of the 2021 Annual Report on Market Issues and Performance. I am Amelia Blanke. I'm the manager on the monitoring and reporting side. The report we're presenting today is the work of a very dedicated department of people. I really want to give them all the credit for some absolutely wonderful analysis and results that are in the report. Take ownership of any of the typos or other edits that are in the presentation today myself. Before we start the presentation today, I would like to let you know that this event is being recorded. The recording will be posted, as will the slides from today's presentation, and they will be posted on CAISO.com. These calls and webinars are recorded for stakeholder convenience, allowing those who are unable to listen to listen later to the recording of the meeting. The recording and any related transcriptions should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. With that, I would like to encourage you today to ask questions either using the chat feature or by raising your hand and asking a question on the call. The presentation today is scheduled for 2 hours. That's an hour longer than we usually do at the request of market participants. I think we should be able to cover the material in less than 2 hours, so there's plenty of time for your questions today. The link at the bottom of the presentation here, the first one is to our annual report. I really would suggest opening that and looking through it. We spend a lot of time putting that together. I'm really very, very proud of it. That, as well as the annual and quarterly reports covering the history of the California ISO and WEIM markets are available on the Department of Market Monitoring website, and the link to that is right below. So with that, I will start the presentation. And please let me know if you can see. No. Luke, event operator, I believe it is not sharing my version of the presentation. I think it's.
If you can go up top to share and then do screen share again.
Okay, I will try that again. Okay, there we go.
All right, we can see it now.
Brilliant. All right, thank you. Highlight of our report this year, one of the headlines typically of the report is that the total estimated wholesale cost of serving California ISO load rose by 33%. That's the nominal cost of wholesale energy shown in this chart in the blue bars. Really one of the highest wholesale energy costs we have seen on a nominal basis. over the last 5 years. The green line on this chart shows a load-weighted combined gas and greenhouse gas costs. That increase in gas costs, which you can see here in the green line, explains much of the increase in wholesale energy costs over the quarter. Once controlling for that, after accounting for that, the adjusted wholesale energy cost shown in yellow for 2021 was actually 10% lower than the adjusted wholesale energy cost in 2020. This is a note for those of you who have been, I think, attending these calls and reading our reports, our loyal readership for years. We have changed the way that we do that adjustment. We are now adjusting not back to 2009 as we had been doing, but back to the beginning year of the reporting period shown in the chart, so 2017 in this case. And we are adjusting those, adjusting the factor that we use for that adjustment based on interesting regression that we're running to look at really the influence that gas prices are having on energy costs. We had been using for many years an 0.8%, and we are now adjusting that. So if you are interested in the details of that, they are in our report. When we take a look at the wholesale energy cost, which was $12.6 billion, what we see is that, as has been the case for the history of the California ISO, most of that cost is composed of the day-ahead energy cost. One of the things that we track is the percent of the wholesale energy cost that is made up of the day-ahead energy cost. That for this year is about a little over 94%, which is an increase over 91% last year. The reason we track that is that many of the non-day-ahead energy cost components are much more under the control of the market operator. The day-ahead energy cost had been falling as a percent of the overall cost for a number of years. So this is a notable thing that has increased, and it does account for most of the increase in nominal cost year over year. A couple other notes on this chart before I move on to the rest of the report. The increase in most costs can be explained by the increase in gas costs, and you'll see us note that for reference when we go over the particular components of the cost. Taking a look at our ISO prices, we can see the increase here. These are showing quarterly average prices. Blue is the day-ahead energy price. Yellow is showing the 15-minute energy price on an average quarterly basis for CAISO area DLAPs. And the green is showing the 5-minute price. A few notes on this chart I think are worthy of mention here. One is that the day-ahead price is on average higher than the 15-minute price, but that gap has narrowed over time. I think most of you are aware the ISO's market includes a feature that allows for virtual bidding or convergence bidding, which allows for financial arbitrage between the day-ahead and 15-minute market. 5-minute market prices are substantially lower, continuing a pattern that we have noted since the middle of 2020. One of the factors that we think can contribute to this is a persistent difference between operator adjustments to load in the 15-minute market and the 5-minute market. We'll cover that later in the presentation today. Obviously, one of the big stories this year is natural gas prices. This chart is showing monthly average prices at Henry Hub, which is the national hub, in the dark blue, PG&E Citygate in yellow, SoCal Citygate in red, El Paso Permian in the southwest, and Northwest Sumas in the light blue. You can see on this chart, there was a substantial increase in February of 2021. That was associated with Winter Storm Uri, which led to very high gas prices, not only in the hubs that we're showing here, but really across much of the United States. I want to highlight on this chart also so that the change in average, even ignoring the price spike that occurred in February, we have seen an increase in average in gas prices across the greater Western energy imbalance market footprint, and that is associated with an increase in prices. This is the one chart in this presentation that is not in the annual report, and thank you to Nicole Munt, who's the analyst who extended it through 2022. This chart shows in the dashed black line the SoCal Citygate gas price, shows in the blue line the day-ahead energy price on a monthly average basis in CAISO, and the yellow line in the 15-minute market, and the green line in the 5-minute market. The correlation here, I think, is a powerful demonstration, powerful visual for the correlation that we see between gas prices, and in this case, SoCal Citygate, and electricity prices. SoCal Citygate is just one of the many hubs that sets gas price indices in the California ISO and WEIM market. Without congestion, prices at one gas hub can really influence prices across the footprint. We see that as gas prices are often at the margin. Before I move on, I'll stop here and see if there are any questions on the call. A reminder, and I think I may not have said this, you can use the raise hand feature. If you called in, you can press #2, and feel free to use the comment feature. I don't see the comments pop up, so I'd appreciate a note from a text or a note from
there's a comment from C.D. McLean. The plot in slide 4 would benefit from volume, megawatt hours, bars on a second.
Thank you. All right.
We also have a caller on the line as well.
Okay. I'd be happy to take that.
Kelly, please go ahead. All right, Kelly, I'm going to unmute your line again. Please go ahead. Seems like she might be having some audio issues.
Kelly, if you would hold your question, I will go through I'll answer Judy McLean's question about volume. The next few slides cover some of the load. That's the demand that was served, both in the CAISO and the WEIM, and that will help with volumes. And then, Kelly, if you would re-enter the queue, maybe we can take your question without the background buzz. Lower loads within the California ISO balancing area were lower, both on a peak basis and on an average total annual basis in 2021 than in 2020. The top portion of this slide shows the actual peak going back here to 2017 compared to the yellow dashed line, which is the 1 and 2 year peak forecast or the median peak forecast, and in green, the 1 and 10 year peak forecast. Overall, we've seen a consistent decrease in the average load served. That is not projected in any of the planning documents looking out, 5, 10, 20 years. That's not projected to continue, but it has been a fairly consistent pattern over the last 3 or 4 years within the California ISO. We have quite a few new charts in the annual report this year if you're interested in more information on load. One of these compares the average hourly load on an annual basis over the same time period. What we see here is a decrease, the same decrease that we were seeing in the overall averages, but particularly a decrease in the midday hours. Based on this pattern, our leading hypothesis is that a lot of the decrease in load may be associated with behind-the-meter solar generation, which has increased quite a lot. The ISO has published and has done some interesting studies looking at changes in load, doing a much more sophisticated job than we can do of controlling for differences in temperature. One of the features of 2021 was actually a relatively warm Q3, but that relatively high Q3 temperature was not driving the increase in load that we would have seen in prior years, and that can have to do with the distribution. A lot of the California ISO load is associated with coastal communities, residential load. Moving on, one of the features of this 2021 annual report is really expanded coverage on our Western energy imbalance market. The chart on the left shows the non-CAISO Western energy imbalance market load on an average monthly basis. This is average monthly, not peak. The chart on the right shows peak load for each of the balancing areas, including the CAISO, in the Western energy imbalance market. and shows the load during the WEIM system peak. One of the advantages of the diversity that comes with the broader WEIM footprint is that load doesn't peak at the same time in all of our Western energy imbalance market areas. You'll note if you look at this chart that some of our Western energy imbalance market areas are winter peaking. Some are summer peaking. And that diversity in both demand, load, as well as supply allows for increased reliability and increases the competitiveness across the market. Overall, expansion of the Western energy imbalance market has improved the overall structure and performance of the real-time market as a whole. As new areas have joined, they bring with them not only an increased diversity of load, but also increased transmission and a broader diversity of generation. Really high level, we have seen in 2021 4 new areas joining and 1 expanding in 2021, and continued increases in the WEIM in 2022. I'll just note, if you look at the overall load served on the system peak, which was July 9th, that overall load is about a little under 70% of peak load for the WEC. That's an increase over 2020. Broadly, I'll share that we're seeing a lot of the same pricing patterns in the WEIM that we saw in 2020. Typically, areas in the Northwest are separated by congestion from the rest of the system, with lower prices in the Northwestern region. In peak hours, California area prices exceed other areas due to both greenhouse gas compliance costs and congestion. I will stop here for Callie's question, which, Callie, if your line is unmuted, we'd be happy to take that.
So she sent a question via the chat. Her question was, on slide 6, are those just prices in the South or load-weighted average of the DLAPS?
Those are thanks, Callie, that's a good question. These are load-weighted prices across the system. We use the SoCal Citygate price because it tends to be, and you can see this on this chart, it does, and not always, but it does tend to either move with or exceed the PG&E Citygate price. And often prices can be set by gas resources in the South. I forgot to note, I included a link here on the bottom for the peak load history, which the ISO posts. That's a fascinating document if you are interested in changes in load over time. One of the things you'll note is that the time of day of the system peak, which last year was 43,982, has gotten later and later in the day over time. Also, there's been a tendency for those peaks to happen later and later in the year, so more frequently in September.
And she also has a follow-up. Can you remind me on the pricing slides if this is a load-weighted average of all DLPs or an average of all nodes?
It's a load-weighted average for DLAPs, which are the aggregated CAISO load aggregation points. Okay, moving on. But again, please do interrupt with questions. We added an extra hour.
Actually, Amelia, Jan Strack, is the reason there's no zero energy prices on slide 4 during spring renewable curtailment simply due to averaging?
The question is about prices in Q2. There are zero prices in Q2. We do have a statistic in the report which shows the frequency of those Q2 prices, and I believe we also published the number of hours in which there were zero or below zero negative prices. But these are average prices, as are these. So although, and I will show a slide later that shows the average hourly price, we do tend to see zero or below zero negative prices occurring when solar energy is generating at its peak. One of the other points, and I didn't note this on the WEIM load slide, but the system peak for WEIM was July 9th. On July 9th, there was a fire, the bootleg fire, which not only threatened but impacted transmission from the northwest into the CAISO. Many of the Flex Alert and other system emergency hours for the California ISO were on that during that early July period. In June, there was a heat dome similar to the weather that is in the Pacific Northwest this week, actually, which really increased the demand for electricity in the Pacific Northwest. You can see that pattern a little bit in the monthly average that we're showing here for bilateral prices. The yellow line here is showing the monthly average for the peak package on Palo Verde. That's the major hub for electricity prices in the south. The blue line is showing the Mid-Columbia peak package on average. The dashed lines are showing average prices in our day-ahead market over the same hours for Pacific Gas and Electric and Southern California Edison in the dark gray and light gray, respectively. So what you can see here is, and this is a change that we've seen happen over the last 5 years, there are instances in which demand increases substantially outside of the CAISO, and we do see monthly average prices for both Palo Verde and Mid-Columbia, which can exceed the CAISO day-ahead prices for the same period. Though in general, they do tend to be lower on average. And for 2021, we see that happening in June and in July. When we look at changes in net interchange for the CAISO, we can see the same effect. This chart is comparing average hourly quarterly values for 2020 and 2021. So each section is a quarter of hourly averages comparing 2020 to 2021. The yellow and blue at the top are day-ahead and 15-minute import values. The yellow and blue below the line are showing, respectively, day-ahead and 15-minute market export values. The dotted line shows the net interchange in the 15-minute market before EIM. The solid gray line adds EIM net interchange. A couple things I think are worth pointing out on this chart and very striking. One is a decrease in imports across the board on an average hourly basis. The second is an increase in exports. Not a substantial increase in the Q3, but overall an increase for the year. That predictably leads to a decrease in net interchange before EIM. And a more substantial decrease in that net interchange year over year in every quarter, especially in the middle of the day, once WEIM transfers are included. Very, very striking. The California ISO was in the second quarter a net exporter for the peak solar hours of the day. In response to the question earlier, these are the prices in these hours reflect these market results. So these are hours in which the energy price is very low. And in those hours, we're seeing a lot of export through the WEIM. In 2022, we've had intervals in which more than 100% of the California ISO was load was supported by renewable resources. Part of the reduction, there's been an increase in what is usually called renewable curtailment, so economic backing down of renewable resources. Those values would be substantially higher without the exports that the Western energy imbalance market allows. And you can see that happening on this chart. One of the other factors we've really seen moving the California ISO and WEIM markets is the available hydroelectric supply. The chart on the left shows average hydroelectric generation, which by month for 2021 in red at the bottom of the chart, 2020 in yellow, which was higher, and 2019, which was quite a bit higher. We included 2015 as well, as that was another very low year for hydroelectric generation in the California ISO. The chart on the right shows total hydroelectric generation in the California ISO going back to 2011 compared to the snowpack conditions as of April 1st. The average snowpack for 2022 was even lower. One note I'll make, there's the direct effect of low hydroelectric is the change in the available capacity, change in supply, change in generation. offered in the market. An indirect effect is the increase in fire risk. As I mentioned earlier, the bootleg fire in southern Oregon had a substantial impact on the market in 2021. This is one of the new charts that we include for the WEIM this year, and I wanted to highlight it in the report. This chart is showing our average hourly participating non-CAISO WEIM generation. It's really interesting to me. You tend to think of the WEIM participating generation, which is a little less than half gas and coal. But when we look at that's the participating capacity. When we look at the generation and average generation, what we see is that about 76%, about a little over 3/4 of the total generation, is coming from gas, natural gas fired and coal resources in the WEIM. This chart is directly comparable to the same chart for the California ISO. This chart, I think the takeaways from this chart have been the same for a number of years. Really, the penetration of the solar during the middle of the day, as well as on this chart, you can see a relatively small decrease in the hydro. The shaping in the later hours, when we tend to see the higher prices, hours ending 19 and 20, 21, are the hours at the end of the day as that solar generation declines. We see the increase being met by natural gas, shown in light blue, some hydro in dark blue, as well as imports, shown in red. This is one of my new favorite charts in the report. What we're seeing here is the change in average hourly generation year on year. We ran the same chart for the WEIM. It's much less interesting, partially because the changes in the WEIM tend to come from the new areas being added into the system. This is showing just for the California ISO, the change year over year on an average hourly basis in generation. The black line shows the net change in generation. What you can see is over much of the day, there was a decrease in net generation. Much of that decrease is coming from a reduction in imports, shown in blue. There was also a reduction in hydro, shown in dark blue, in almost every hour of the day. Increase in natural gas generation in the off-peak hours, as well as in the peak post-solar hours of the day. Increase in solar generation, wind, and I'll highlight here an increase in battery generation, shown both in the morning peak and visible on this chart in the peak hours of the day. When we look at the changes in capacity registered and participating with the California ISO, what we see overall is a long-term reduction in the natural gas-fired capacity, being made up for by an increase in renewable, solar and wind, as well as demand response, shown in dark red, and batteries, shown in purple. We are running out of colors. Take a closer look at the withdrawals. So those are both retirements, repowerings, any kind of change in status as reflected in the California ISO master file on June 1st. What we see on the left-hand side are those retirements. In the hatched sort of grayed out bar, what we're showing are planned retirements that were extended, either through the once through cooling, OTC stands for once through cooling, or through the RMR process, reliability must run process. Those went through cooling units that were extended. Those extensions were again approved for summer of 2022. Just note that's about 4 very large resources. Capacity, I got a question offline about this, so I'll answer it here. The capacity factors on those resources are fairly low, lower than the standard that we'd expect for a CC, typically, a newer CC, I think reflecting their costs as bid into the market. They do account, however, for a substantial portion of the bid cost recovery. I'll cover that in bid cost recovery. On the right-hand side, what we have are additions to the CAISO market. We continue to see additions coming in for solar resources shown in yellow. And for 2021 and 2022, a very marked increase in available battery capacity shown in dark green. The red at the top of the chart indicates the addition of hybrid resources. Typically, those are batteries paired with another fuel type resource, solar, wind, or natural gas. I'm going to speed up a little bit. One of the things, we have a really interesting section, so if you want to dig in a little bit more, feel free, is on demand response. This is showing monthly average bids in the peak hours from different resource types of demand response for the months of August and September, for 2020 on the left, and for 2021 on the right. The big change that you see here is in the increase in RDRR, reliability demand response, from utility programs. I saw a question pop up in the chat, but I wasn't able to read it in the 10 seconds. Luke, would you mind reading that for me?
Yes. Can you comment on the share of hybrid versus co-located resources regarding recent additions?
I will hold that. I don't have exact numbers at the top of my head for hybrid versus co-located. The ISO has added new market functionality that allows for both co-located and hybrid resource types. I believe most of the additions are hybrid rather than co-located, but I need to double check that. I do believe it's in the report. I wanted to note on demand response that just for scale, that the most of the demand response that we see here, if you note the axis of this chart, we're seeing ends at 400 megawatts. Most of the demand response in our market is really coming through utility operated programs that are reflected as credits for resource adequacy purposes. Looking at performance, the performance is based on the self-reported performance. We've seen generally an increase in performance compared to 2020, although when capped at the individual resource schedule, we're seeing still substantially less than 100%. And again, that is based on self-reported performance. This chart shows in a few different ways the substantial increase in battery capacity that occurred before the summer of 2021. That's something that makes, I think, the California ISO balancing areas market really different than a lot of the other markets in the United States and really globally. I think we've got a penetration of storage resources that is very, very different. We saw a big change with the way that those storage resources are dispatched in the system. What you see here are the average hourly schedules split into different categories. The dark yellow above the axis is for energy discharging. The light yellow below is for charging. Blue shows regulation down and regulation up, two of our ancillary services. Green shows spin. And then we're also showing flexible ramping up and flexible ramping down on this chart. So first thing is, it's easy to note the large increase. The second thing I think is noteworthy on this chart is the increase, particularly in the energy schedules. We have a lot more coverage in the report. I'll just note here we're comparing regulation down on the left and regulation up on the right, 2020 quarterly averages to 2021. The difference in the volume of offered capacity is higher than the difference in cleared. Part of that is a result in the change in bid prices for both regulation down and regulation up, which we saw occur in this market. We also saw a change in bidding behavior for energy. This chart is showing day ahead on the top and real-time bids on the bottom from Q3 of 2020 through, on an average hourly basis, Q4 of 2021. And see, starting in Q3 and Q4, a real increase in the day-ahead average bid to discharge for the fleet of batteries. The price here is the average price at the nodes where the storage resources are located, weighted average. We are running a net market revenue simulation for a hypothetical storage resource. This is our second year of running that. Apologies for the slide full of a lot of numbers. The big point to make on this chart is that for the scenario in which we are including regulation costs, overall, the net market revenues estimated for storage resources are high. The system level, and we do this for the local areas as well, because many of the storage resources are located in local areas. But overall, net market revenues are above $100 for the year, although down slightly on a system level between 2020 and 2021. That is substantially higher than the net market revenues that we estimate for hypothetical combined cycle and hypothetical combustion turbine. This chart shows the net market revenues in green for a hypothetical combined cycle at NP15, major hub in the north of CAISO, and SP15 in the south. Increased for NP15, decreased for SP15. That is compared to the going forward fixed costs, which are the thicker orange bar at the bottom of the chart, and to the estimated levelized fixed cost target shown in orange at the top of the chart. The blue bar showing the CAISO soft offer cap price is included as an estimate of a generous capacity payment. Capacity payments are necessary to make up the difference between the levelized fixed cost, which is the estimated cost for constructing a new resource entering the market, but not in the case of NP15 in this year to meet going forward fixed costs. This is the same metric for combustion turbines. Here we see the same decrease in SP15 net revenues. And for both NP15 and SP15, we see that some capacity payment is needed to meet going forward fixed costs. Move on to outages. Overall, there was an expectation that outages might increase in 2020 with the changes that come with some of the quarantine measures associated with COVID-19. Overall, we saw an increase in outages in this year. This is the chart I was waiting for the discussion of negative prices. The red dashed line on this chart shows the average net load for CAISO compared to average hourly prices. So again, on this chart, we're seeing especially in peak hours, that the 5-minute price shown in green is below the day ahead and 15-minute price shown in blue and yellow. And we see the close correlation with net load. Net load is the CAISO system load minus utility scale wind and solar. For reference and looking forward a little bit, for 2022, we have seen instances and days with extraordinarily low net load, approaching zero. Over time, we've seen a deepening of the net load in the middle of the day. There is a nice new chart in the report. Taking a closer look at the 15-minute prices across the load aggregation points in the market, in the WEIM, the broader 15-minute market footprint. This is showing average hourly comparing across load aggregation points. This shows the price decomposed. So the total price is the total LMP shown in the line, which is composed of the system-wide energy price shown in blue, which is the same in all areas in any interval, but some of these areas are new, so they don't all cover the same time period, and that's why you see a slight variation. Those are noted, so these are the new areas in 2021. Those are noted with the asterisk. To that, we add transmission losses, shown in black, congestion within the California ISO footprint, shown in yellow, and congestion on WEIM transfer limits shown in red. The green price component shows the effect of the EIM greenhouse gas price, which is effectively lowering prices paid at load aggregation points outside of California. One of the points I typically make on this chart is that these are showing prices paid at the load aggregation point. When an area joins the WEIM and brings transmission into the WEIM, the congestion rents associated with the transmission that are brought into the market are typically split between the areas that are interconnected, or in cases where those transfer limits are connecting with the CAISO, those congestion rents are returned in full to the areas that brought that transmission into the market. This is the same price decomposition for the 5-minute market. Overall, you'll note that the prices are fairly consistent between the two markets. It's lower in the 5-minute market. We do tend to see the highest prices on average in the California regions of the WEIM. And a large part of that has to do with the greenhouse gas component. It is also associated with congestion. There are a lot of metrics in the report on greenhouse gas. This is the one I included in the presentation today. You can see an increase overall in the EIM greenhouse gas price. That is shown in blue for the 15-minute market and in green for the 5-minute market. The prices have been consistently lower in the 5-minute market than they are in the 15-minute market. That has to do with a lower quantity associated with those greenhouse gas imports into California in the 5-minute market. One other note I'll mention here is that when LADWP joined the market, there started to be an issue with the quantity of total greenhouse gas imports into the state of California. The ISO has spoken about this publicly and I believe is doing an assessment of the impact. Essentially, that included base transfers in the total EIM transfer. It's in general, in the case of importing, an increasing greenhouse gas quantity over the greenhouse gas quantity that was truly accounted for by WEIM. Prices, this is showing average monthly prices across the footprint. These really just reflect both energy. These reflect the congestion, both of the transfer constraints and separation that occurs because of test failures in the market. Highlight here Northwestern. Northwestern, which was one of our new areas, had some fairly unique market conditions, which we discussed in the report, and that explains the high cost for them in the month of October. We see overall that EIM transfer constraint congestion has a much greater impact on prices than internal constraint congestion in all areas outside of the California ISO, particularly lowering prices in the Southwest. You see it's binding in the 5-minute market and up to over half, 54% of intervals. This is one of our new charts. This is actually, I think the chart, maybe it's the next chart that we put on the cover of the report this year. It's one of my favorite charts. It takes a little minute to explain, but I think it's worth the time. This chart shows average 15-minute Western Energy Imbalance Market exports in midday hours for April and May of 2021. The outer ring shows the available capacity for export. The inner ring shows the export volume. So the red is showing CAISO. In these hours, energy is flowing over WEIM transfer constraints from CAISO into Bank, SRP, Nevada, APS, Portland, BC Hydro, PowerX, as well as into LADWP, so across the system. Some power, and I'll use Nevada here as a case. So in this case, power is flowing from CAISO to Nevada, and then from Nevada out to Pacific Core East and Idaho Power. The tick marks show the volume of exports. These charts take a while you can spend a happy lunch break tracing power through these. This is the average for midday hours. This is the average for peak load hours in June to September. So it shows a much different pattern. In this case, starting again with the CAISO, which had been exporting in the previous chart, is here importing. In general, there is imports flowing into the CAISO from Arizona, Nevada, and LADWP, as well as some other areas, and then flowing out to the balancing area of Northern California. There aren't any questions on that. I'm going to cover some of our other congestion results.
We do have a caller on the line. Bonnie Blair, please go ahead.
Hi, this is Bonnie Blair. I represent the Six Cities group. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Good. I actually had a question back a few slides in the comparison of market revenues and going forward costs and then fixed levelized costs. And the question was, the comparisons that you did focused on gas-fueled generators. Have you done similar comparisons with respect to storage resources?
Yes, we have. The net market revenues calculation is in the report. We don't have a basis for doing the same kind of comparison we're doing here.
That was really the question. I mean, I saw that the revenues were there, but the comparison with both the going forward fixed costs and the levelized fixed costs wasn't there. Is that because there isn't a good source for those cost figures for battery facilities, or?
There's not we don't happen to have a good source for those right now. These are newer technologies, so right. The costs are more variable.
Okay, fair enough. I guess I at least would be really interested in that comparison because it seems to me that at least in California, and I don't know if this is true throughout the West, but in California, it seems as though there's not much going on in the way of new entry for fossil fueled resources, and it's mostly concentrated in variable and battery storage. So in terms of sort of looking at the incentive structure and sort of the overall adequacy of market revenues, I feel as though it seems like the focus on combined cycle and combustion turbines is maybe a little outdated.
For these charts, that's why we put the emphasis on looking at the comparison to the going forward fixed costs.
Okay.
Shown here. But for reference, you know, the net market revenues that we're showing we're estimating for storage are above $100.
Okay, and is the $100? I mean, what's the significance of that threshold for that?
So $100 per kilowatt year. Is well above the going forward fixed cost for a large a combined cycle or a combustion turbine. So if we may not have a precise figure for the going forward fixed cost for storage, but I would guess that it is lower, as well as the estimated levelized fixed cost for storage.
Okay. Thanks for the explanation.
You are welcome. I will move on to congestion. This is showing day ahead.
Before you move on, we do have a question in the chat. The question is from Susie Niederkorn. The question is, the transfers in page 34 and 37, do they include both dynamic and base or just base?
These are showing the Western Energy Imbalance market transfers. So these are the transfers in the market itself, rather than the base scheduled. That difference is why you see the substantial difference between those Western Energy Imbalance market transfers in the midday hours changing when we look at the average for the peak hours and the peak seasons of the year. The congestion on import constraints overall was down in 2021. Real highlight here is the congestion we saw in the north associated with the bootleg fire in July. Most of that occurring on Weim, which you can see here. Overall, the impact of day-ahead congestion was down. As were day-ahead congestion costs. The pattern you can see for the congestion here is that it's increasing prices in PG&E and decreasing prices in SCE and San Diego Gas and Electric in the day-ahead market in the fourth quarter. You can see these patterns change with quarterly changes in load and availability of renewable output. One of the metrics that DMM has and we'll continue to track, are losses to ratepayers in the congestion revenue rights auction process. In 2021, ratepayers lost over $43 million from auctioned congestion revenue rights. That is down from $70 million in 2020, but up from $22 million in 2019. Overall, ratepayer losses have averaged about $45 million per year after the market changes that went in place with Track 1A and 1B, beginning in 2019. Just note, we're still using preliminary settlement data for 2022, but we do see higher losses in 2022. Those are up to about $70 million for Q1 and Q2 of 2022. The changes that were put in place beginning in 2019 were done to limit systematic losses from congestion revenue rights. We believe that the current auction is unnecessary, we, DMM, and could be eliminated, or if the ISO believes that a market is necessary for hedging, replaced with a market of willing buyers and sellers. One of the other costs that can be associated with congestion are real-time imbalance offset costs. These are the costs that are uplift to measured demand. That means these are costs that are paid by load and exports within the California ISO. Those rose to $177 million for 2021, mostly driven by an increase in congestion offset costs to $147 million. Again, these are preliminary settlement values that are not in the annual report, but I'll share with you that right now for the beginning of 2022, our estimate is that congestion offset costs are already in excess of $150 million just for the first half of the year. I'd recommend to you a call at 1 o'clock, and I promise to stop talking by then, which is being hosted by the ISO covering market results for June. Much of that congestion offset cost is estimated to have occurred in June and is covered in the ISO's report, which will be discussed in a call today at 1. Those real-time imbalance offset costs were actually in excess of total ancillary service costs. In my history of reading annual reports, I think that's the first time I've ever seen that occur. Ancillary service costs actually decreased to $165 million. And overall decreased to about 1.3% of overall wholesale energy costs. A couple factors in that decrease in ancillary service costs, and I'm happy to talk about this more, but I'd send you to the report, which covers a lot of additional material. The operating reserves requirements were lower in 2021 than they had been in 2020. That lower requirement is due to the decrease in generation, which we saw earlier, as well as the decrease in load. So those are typically set by 3% of gen, or 3% plus 3% of load, plus the single largest contingency. We saw a moderate increase in regulation up requirement, and a substantial increase in regulation down requirements, particularly in the midday solar hours. Bid cost recovery costs were up again to 100 and doing some fast math here, 180 million. If you add the WEIM bid cost recovery to the CAISO, they were 158 million in CAISO, which is about 1.2% of total wholesale energy costs, down from 1.4%. A couple highlights on this, and then I'll move on in the interest of time, but I mentioned the went-through cooling resources that were retained. Those account for about a third of the total CAISO bid cost recovery for 2021. Another roughly a third of the bid cost recovery is paid to combined cycle resources, other combined cycle resources. Another note on these is that we saw about $4 million in bid cost recovery payments in the CAISO 2 storage. And I want to note that because there has been some confusion at times on public calls about whether storage resources do receive bid cost recovery payments. They do, they can, and they do. And that amounted to about $4 million in 2021. Convergence bidding, net profits fell to about $38 million. And most of those profits were paid to the financial participants. Shown on the chart here. Energy from exceptional dispatch, so those are CAISO operator dispatches, remained low in 2021, accounting for less than 1% of system load, so 0.5% of system load. Costs increased to $27 million from about $16 million in 2020. One of the other features, sort of other operator actions that we see having CAISO operator actions that we see can have a big impact on the market more broadly, including the WEIM, is load adjustments. The chart on the left-hand side shows average hourly load adjustments in the hour-ahead market in the solid line for 2021, 2020, and 2019. And apologize here, I left off, didn't make the legend quite big enough, so I'll fix that. For the 5-minute market in the dashed lines. What we saw in 2021 was a substantial increase in the net load peak hour ahead adjustments. If you're interested in this, I'll point you to an interesting set of studies the ISO's done running counterfactual market results with and without imbalance conformance load adjustments. What they find predictably is that load adjustments increase demand, which has an effect on all kinds of different supplies. So not only imports, advisory WEIM transfers in the hour-ahead market or in the 15-minute market, but also internal generation. The chart on the right shows the distribution of 15-minute market imbalance load conformance, which tends to be very close to the hour-ahead market. This we added as a request, and I'm highlighting it here to note this is the one chart in the report in that we actually have the wrong chart in the report. So if you look fast at the report, you can see this posted online right now. You can see that the 15-minute market imbalance conformance increases a lot in Q1 of 2022, which is the data in the chart in the posted report currently. The chart on the right here is showing the distribution for the 15-minute market imbalance conformance for 2021. So that we included at the request of some of our readers. So again, very much appreciate the questions today and appreciate getting questions offline as well. We do pay attention to those and do try to respond to those. This slide is covering operator adjustments to the residual unit commitment process. The chart on the left-hand side is showing the net RUC requirement in gray, which is composed of cleared net virtual supply, the difference between the RUC forecast and day-ahead cleared capacity, an adjustment for renewable resources shown in yellow, and the operator adjustment shown here in red. The operator adjustments were down over a third compared to 2020 and were concentrated in the peak load hours of the day, shown on the left-hand side, and in the peak demand months of the year, July through September. Chart on the right shows the distribution in those peak load months of operator adjustments to RUC. Box whisker. So it shows the variation in those up to 4,000 megawatts of additional demand. Flexible ramping capacity. We have a lot of great charts on this, something we've been commenting on for quite a long time. It's designed to enhance reliability and market performance by procuring real-time ramping capacity. Prices are zero in almost all intervals on a system level. A big change to this market was the addition of a minimum area constraint in November of 2020. That was introduced only in the 15-minute market, but was added to the 5-minute market in February of 2022. That is frequently binding in the CAISO, but not in other areas. DMM is supportive of and looking forward to the ISO's planned fall 2022 implementation of nodal procurement. I don't know why there's a parenthesis there. Procurement of capacity from resources not able to meet system uncertainty because of resource characteristics or congestion has been one of the reasons that we have seen a lot of zero prices. That really reduces the effectiveness of the product overall. One of the DMM, Department of Market Monitoring, recommendations has been to increase the horizon of uncertainty that is considered in the flexible ramping product. The product as it exists today considers differences between the 15-minute market and the 5-minute market, and between advisory and binding 5-minute schedules. So it's a very short term. This is one of the new charts in the report for flexible ramping and WEIM, quite honestly also. What this shows is the CAISO area minimum requirement in the dashed line in the middle of the chart. The total system requirement in the black line at the top of the chart. This is for July 9th, which was the WEIM system peak for the year, if not the CAISO. What we're showing here is that when the CAISO flexible ramping capacity does not meet the local requirement, there is a local relaxation. So that's the difference between the requirement for CAISO and CAISO capacity as priced at the demand curve for CAISO. That relaxation, shown in red, then meets the system level requirement. That's one of the reasons that we believe we have seen a persistent frequency of zero prices on a system level. This chart is just another example, and I think I have enough time to talk about this. This chart, sorry, my phone isn't telling me what time it is. This chart is showing how flexible ramping capacity can be essentially isolated from the system. This is an example for the Northwest, showing that although there is available transfer capacity between areas, there is not available transfer capacity from the aggregated area to the rest of the system. So flexible ramping product procured in this isolated area can meet the requirement with a very low opportunity cost, which leads to that zero price result. I'm speeding up a bit because we have about half an hour. I will stop for questions, and then I want to make sure I hit the rest of my slides. Hearing none, one of the features of the annual report that I look forward to seeing every year is the results of our experimental reruns of the market. We do this to assess the competitiveness of the market. Overall, our estimate for the total markup for 2021 of the day-ahead market is $1.41, or about 2.5%, so very low. We're showing the average price cost markup we estimate would exist in each month as the small red portion on the top of each chart, top of each blue bar. We do that by rerunning the day-ahead market with gas resource bids capped at the default energy bid, with import bids capped at a generous default energy bid estimate based on bilateral prices, and with commitment costs for gas resources capped at 110% of the proxy cost. Overall, we saw an increase in the structural competitiveness of the market in 2021. The bars on this chart show the number of hours by quarter in which the residual supply index, so competitive supply as a fraction of demand, less than 1. RSI 1 is with 1 pivotal supplier removed, 2 with the biggest 2, and 3 with the biggest 3. I want to highlight something that quickly that we say frequently is that the state policy, both of the state of California for the day-ahead market and for other states, really forms the basis for the competitive market outcomes that we see. A couple big things that we've seen starting to happen 2 years ago is a shift from investor-owned utilities to community choice aggregators and an overall decrease in long-term capacity contracts. We made a change to the way we are assessing the performance of resource adequacy. Resource adequacy is the California state program that requires load-serving entities to show resources to the California ISO market and requires those resources to bid in and to the market. It's the must-offer obligation. It's with the must-offer obligation. The way we are assessing that performance this year is looking at the peak hours for the year. We're selecting those peak hours as restricted maintenance. That's what RMO stands for. Flex alert, or a higher level of alert. Looking across the last 3 years, you can see that the number of those hours has changed a lot over time. There were only 14 alert plus hours in 2021. Overall, we see that 90%, more than 90% of capacity is available in the real-time market in these hours in each year. Far lower percents are scheduled. One of the values that were, I'll just explain the difference between schedule and uncapped schedule, or meter and uncapped meter, is whether or not we are including capacity above the capacity that is offered as resource adequacy capacity. When we look at the distribution of hours, and this is for 2021, you can see the alert plus hours, which is the hours that we're really concentrating on. We're mostly in July. These are almost all associated with the import transmission constraint that occurred associated with the bootleg fire for bringing in power from the Northwest. This chart is comparing the number of hours in the bars to the total resource adequacy capacity in red, including credits in the dashed line, and average hourly load in those hours. Capacity was substantially above. Overall, and this is again looking at 14 hours, so a much smaller number of hours. A couple highlights of the performance. Overall, we're seeing that more than 90% is available in the real-time market. About 85% is bid in. We see metered less than scheduled for import because of the hours that we are looking at. These, again, are the hours in which import capacity was severely constrained by the fire in Southern Oregon. So that's why we see the impact on Import Rra performance there. Another point I'll make on this is that more than half of the resource adequacy capacity is use limited in some way, shown in the bottom half of the chart. There were very important, I think every year something pops out of the report that's something that we sort of saw happening over time over the year, but wasn't really striking until the annual report. One of the things for 2021 that came out of the writing is just the sheer number of changes that were made to the market. One of the big impactful changes to the market was actually made in September of 2020, following the events of August of 2020. Following the load curtailment of August 2020, the ISO took measures to limit high priority exports in the RUC process to those that were physically supported by supply in the residual unit commitment process. Those exports not supported can rebid into the market in real time. So looking at the high load days in 2021, when we look at the day ahead, we can see for these high load hours, we can see that there are hours in which in green, there are economic exports that are cleared in the dark, and in the lighter shading dropped in the residual unit commitment process, so not supported, as well as self-scheduled exports. The highest priority self-scheduled exports generally cleared, shown in red. When we look at the same thing in real time, we again see that for the most part, schedules that were not cleared in the real time for exports and peak hours were economic bids, not cleared. This is one of two slides, and this is not a complete list, but some of the very important things that changed. One is the residual unit commitment process for export prioritization I just mentioned. Two, the minimum flexible ramping product requirement, which we discussed, which was implemented in November of 2020. In February, there were two changes made to the WEIM resource efficiency evaluation. I'll highlight quickly, DMM has done a lot of reporting on the WEIM resource efficiency test if you are interested in that. And it is, I think, a super, very important feature of the market and interesting. We have a lot of reports posted as well as data, and we are happy to take your questions on those. Following the increase in gas prices in February, and actually during that period, the ISO implemented CCW, so the default energy bid and commitment cost bid cap real-time adjustment process was implemented to allow scheduling coordinators to submit requests to adjust their reference levels. Bidding above the $1,000 per megawatt hour energy bid cap was introduced in March, work order 831 compliance. In May, there were changes made to the gas burn constraint shaping process. And additionally, the ISO automated consideration of gas burn constraints in the automated local market power mitigation process. So that happened in May, replacing a manual process. So I think we were all happy to see that. Addition of net load uncertainty to the bid range capacity test, that is one of the resource sufficiency evaluations, happened in June. That additional requirement accounted for the majority of failures of bid range capacity. That net load uncertainty was removed from the bid range capacity test. In June. Well, actually before that, but following that. Phase 2 of FERC Order 831 compliance, so that's bidding above the $1,000 cap, was added in June. Adjustment for Import Rra. The big effect we saw on Import Rra was not from changes in CAISO regulations, but actually changes in requirement from the CPUC, which required in most hours that those resources be available and scheduled into the market. So bid in at or below zero. We saw enhancements for summer readiness in June. Those allow for imports to be paid the hour-ahead price in some instances as bid, in some instances rather than the binding 15-minute market price, as well as pricing considerations for demand response, the reliability demand response resources, and the instances in which load is armed to serve as an ancillary service. Wheeling priority changes were added in August, as well as self-scheduled export priority changes. There were some changes to the ancillary service testing process in September. Those allow for success in one operating reserve to qualify for another operating reserve, essentially. Battery energy storage resources became subject to market power mitigation in November with an associated default energy bid. And we also cover the WEIM resource sufficiency evaluation enhancements, which came in June of 2022, so June of this year. Those are discussed in full in one of the monthly resource sufficiency evaluation reports, which is available on our website, and I suggest if you're interested, you look there. This chart highlights the wheel. So the wheel changes that were made allowed for the registration of high priority wheels. We did see just over 1,000 megawatts registered in August, but we did not see scheduling up to that 1,000 megawatt reservation. We saw scheduling in very few days and at much lower values in both August and September. In the interest of time, I'm glad I had 2 hours today. The CPUC has made a lot of changes to the resource adequacy program. DMM supports these efforts. Many of the things noted here are actually passed as decisions by the CPUC, and we support these changes. In terms of recommendations, I'll go over these very, very, very quickly. Recommendations are included in full in the report. Our large recommendation for the resource sufficiency test, and again, we have been providing a lot of coverage of that, both of market results and even providing data, is that the sufficiency test reconsider how to deal with uncertainty and consideration of the economic consequences of balancing area failure. Considering using an economic, this is an idea I think that came from a market participant, but it's one we think is worth consideration. Flexible ramping product. As I mentioned, we are looking forward to the ISO's implementation of locational procurement, and we continue to recommend that the ISO expand the time horizon. Congestion revenue rights. We have a long-standing recommendation that there be an elimination or further limit on the auction of congestion revenue rights by the ISO. If there is a need for these hedging instruments, then a market could be established for these hedging instruments based on willing buyers and sellers. Day-ahead market enhancements, very closely tied to EDAM. We are very supportive of a consideration, again, of that longer-term imbalance product, and think it requires careful consideration to ensure that that imbalance product creates capacity that is then available to meet the uncertainty that does arise in the real-time market. For the expanded day-ahead market enhancements initiative, our two high-level recommendations are that there be this mechanism for ensuring capacity in real time, especially if there is consideration to remove the real-time must-offer obligation that exists in the CAISO. And second, to clarify, and there have been meetings even since we drafted our annual report that I think go some direction towards this, but that the ISO and stakeholders clarify details of what happens after EDAM in the real-time market during very tight conditions and shortages in the real time. Both what happens on a system level, if the entire system is short, and then what if shortages arise in particular areas. Scarcity pricing and system market power, we have long-standing recommendations on both of those. Battery resources, I'll highlight we support the ISO's continued refinement of modeling of battery resources in the market, especially as they've become a much bigger part of the fleet. There, one of the things we highlight in the report is a need to consider bid cost recovery for those battery resources and consider some potential implementation changes to the bid cost recovery framework that exists today. And demand response resources, again, we have a long-standing set of recommendations on demand response resources. And that is the end of my slides today, with 10 minutes remaining for questions.
We do have a caller on the line. Dan Williams, please go ahead.
Hey, Amelia, Dan Williams from Customized Energy Solutions. First, just thank you, congratulations, excellent report as always, and just more information than any of us can possibly comprehend all the time. But even with that, I still have an extra question. So way back when you were talking about storage resources, one of the things stood out to me is that the amount of flexible ramp up that's being awarded to storage resources, increased significantly. And I'm just curious if DMM has looked at sort of the benefits or considerations, what impact being held for flexible ramp product has on storage resources, just sort of given how much of the storage fleet is being scheduled for flex up.
That's a very good question, Dan. Thank you. You always have interesting questions that send us down an interesting path. From a flexible ramping product perspective, one of the concerns we can have is that capacity that is procured has a low marginal cost to a low opportunity cost to the flexible ramping product, partially because it's not available. That can occur with storage resources because, for example, they may not have enough state of charge to actually be able to provide the flexible ramping product that the market is procuring there. I think the question you're asking is actually from the other perspective, which is how does being held for a flexible ramping product affect the profitability of storage resources? Interesting, what we're seeing there is that often, and I'm generalizing from a few cases here, what can happen for storage resources is both for flexible ramping, but also for, especially for ancillary services regulation and other ancillary services, that the storage resource schedules can differ between the day-ahead and real-time market, and that those differences between the day-ahead and real-time market whether they be to respect the necessary state of charge, for example, or to place the storage resource, where it needs to be to provide the ancillary service award that it has, often lead to the bid cost recovery that we see for those resources. So they are made whole for their bid costs in both the day-ahead and real-time market, just as any other resource would be.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for sharing on that. The other question that I had is just, I may have missed it, but I haven't seen any discussion recently around the PMIN burden issues or trends on the CAISO system. You noted about the very low net load levels during certain hours of the day, but I'm not sure that I've seen where there's been a discussion of sort of movement towards more flexible bidding of rampable resources. I think there's some data on the flexibility of bidding of VERS and the percentage of VERS curtailments that were economic versus the self-scheduled. But just kind of curious if that's something that you've been tracking, if there's some trends over time. And I'm asking because it may have some policy implications for some of the EDAM considerations around the some proposals are maybe hinging on having additional amounts of self-schedules, and just curious if there's anything we need to be aware of with that from a trend perspective.
Yeah, great question again. Big picture, what we see for the renewable curtailment is that it's economic, so it's the response of economically bid-in resources to prices that occur in the market. We are seeing some self-scheduled curtailment, but very little. And that's been consistent over time. If you look at the chart that's on the screen right now, you can see that we have a substantial amount of baseload. This isn't all PMIN, but what you're seeing is baseload capacity that may be less flexible and not able to back down. So especially the nuclear facility here, and as well as, for example, gas resources that may not be able to start quickly and therefore need to be kept on at their minimum generating level through the middle of the day. We have a board memo, and I don't remember off the top of my head, this would have been from the beginning of 2022, which, and when I say we, what I mean is DMM. But DMM has a board memo from 2022 that goes over some of the market results that occur in these kind of instances when you have very low net load in the California ISO. In those instances, what we see is, and two things. One is the high generation from California, utility scale wind and solar. Also in Q2, we tend to see a lot of run-of-river hydro, and that also is entering the supply stack at a very, very low price or at a self-schedule, paired with load, not net load, but load that on some days in 2022 has been lower at 1 o'clock in the afternoon than it is at 3 o'clock in the morning. You can see those load shapes on the California ISO website if you're interested, and I'd suggest looking at a Sunday, pick any given Sunday in February or March. What happens in those instances is that the flexibility that we have from the Western Energy Imbalance market, as well as exports through the hourly block exports in the hour-ahead market and 15-minute market exports, allow energy to be produced from a lot of those renewable resources that would otherwise have been curtailed. And instead of being economically backed down by the market, that power is generated and then exported from the California ISO. And you can see, this again is the WEIM for 2021. But you can see almost all of the export available WEIM transfer capacity from CAISO is occupied by exports in intervals like that.
Great, appreciate sharing the extra thoughts there. I'll leave a couple minutes for others in case there are any. Thanks again.
Thanks, Dan.
At this time, we have no further callers in queue.
If there aren't any other questions, I would like to thank you all for your time and attention. This report is the product of a lot of hard work by our staff, but it's also a response to the questions that we get. So if you do have, just out of curiosity or interest in any other kind of analysis, please do let us know. We may not be able to do that. We may not be able to publish it, but we're always interested to hear what your questions are. So please do feel free to contact us. To do that, you can feel free to contact me, ablanky@kaiso.com on the market notice, or if you would like, there is a contact number for the Department of Market Monitoring, which is dmm@kaiso.com. You can feel free to use that as well. Many thanks, all of you, for your time today. I would recommend tuning in at 1 o'clock for the ISO's presentation of their June 2022 report. Thanks again.